Okay, moving on to our next presentation. Right now, we're going to go through, again, the presentation on the moral argument for God. And this is going to be based, obviously, continuing with a similar outline that's laid out in the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. And it's really a presentation that's been modified somewhat, but it's based on the original one by Norman Geisler called The 12 Points That Show Christianity is True. So if you want more information, you can go to normgeisler.com, ngim.org for Norman Geisler's information. And for Frank Turek, you can go to crossexamined.org. There's also a free phone app, and you can link to the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast in iTunes if you have that. So anyways, moving along, as we've been moving through the 12 points, we know that originally we went through the truth about reality is knowable, the opposite of true is false, and it is true that the theistic God exists. Now, this is where we're at right now, and we will move on through these other so that we can accomplish all 12. But right now, we are on the third. We went through the cosmological argument, the teleological argument. Now we're on the moral argument. There is a moral law, so therefore, there's a moral lawgiver. And there are three arguments as we've walked through. You can see them here, and we're on the third one. People have a sense of morality. Everybody does. It doesn't matter who you are. You all have a sense of what you believe is right and wrong, and everybody has some sense that certain things are just not right. So the logic for the moral argument is very simple. There is a moral law requiring a moral lawgiver. You can't have a moral law without a lawgiver because you need a mind to make a law. Laws do not just occur, right?
Can you be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed His moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in His command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation upon which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because He is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong, do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, "Hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice," you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
I really like that little cartoon video because it really summarizes the entire moral argument. Makes it very simple. Now, there's obviously more detail that we can get into, which we are going to, because we need to understand it from the standpoint of being able to discuss it. Mostly when you have an issue with somebody else regarding whether God exists, the moral argument is the one that actually hits home. It blends not only the intellectual and philosophical aspects of God's existence, but it also becomes very personal. The cosmological argument is intellectual, it's philosophical, along with the teleological or design argument, but the moral argument is much, much more personal because it deals with how we react to certainly aspects of morality. So we would all find some things evil and wrong, or what we would call immoral. And this is not justifiable in any culture. Obviously, this is a picture from Nazi Germany. So if there is no God, if God does not exist, the Nazis were not wrong. In other words, in the moral argument, there's nobody that can actually claim that they were wrong for what they did. Love is no better than rape because there's no definition for right or wrong. There is no human rights, so people can cry out for rights, but rights don't exist, not in an atheistic framework. Tolerance is no better than intolerance. Religious crusades are not wrong, and you can't complain about the problem of evil because there really is no definition for evil because there's no definition of good. You have no comparison to an absolute if God doesn't exist.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Let's leave aside Christianity and historical examples for a second. All night you guys have been grappling with issues like morality and, what is right, what is wrong, and meaning. But my question is simply, why are you so afraid of subjective moral reasoning? I mean, do you think that we're all just going to start raping and pillaging just because we don't have a book to tell us what to do? I mean, are you afraid of that? Like, I'm not, because that's not going to happen. And Nazis were bad, but there were Christian Nazis and there were atheist Nazis. So I don't see... What are you so afraid of?
Do you lock your door at night?
Yeah. Sure.
I hear what you're saying. Sounds very cavalier, though. My goodness. If we weren't afraid of all of this, we would not be in a national debt. The billions...
China is secular.
Sorry?
China is secular.
Sorry?
China is secular.
That's right. What does that
I
mean?
mean, they're not raping and pillaging, and neither are we.
Oh my, oh my, oh my, oh my, oh my. Have you read what happened during the Red Guards Rebellion? Have you read what happened during the Boxer Rebellion? Do you know who has killed more people in the 20th century than China and Russia? 60 million apiece? Wow. It makes the Holocaust seem tame. The 20th century became the bloodiest century in history. And the reason it became the bloodiest century in history, I can see, is you could just see the weapons of our warfare were piling up and there was no guiding principle to take us anywhere. Now, in a perfect world, yes, we don't need to be afraid. Have you seen what happens in our courts of law, where people supposedly love each other and all that comes about in hate and vitriol and damage? I don't think the question is fairly stated as what are you afraid of. I'm just saying it is basically unlivable. I didn't conclude that. An atheist like Jean-Paul Sartre concluded it. We killed more people in the 20th century than the previous 19 put together. And your question is, what are we afraid of? The fact of the matter is, if morality is purely subjective, then you have absolutely nothing from stopping anybody for being a subjective moralist to choose to just zing one through your forehead and say, that's my answer. How do you stop that? Obviously, you don't believe that's the way it should be. No, neither do I. So it's not a case of what am I afraid of. It's a case of the fact that if you're willing to say to me that moral reasoning can be purely subjective, I just say to you, look out, you ain't seen nothing yet if everybody believed what you did. Do you know, funny, interesting, when I was in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Stalin eliminated 15 million of his own people. 15 million of his own people. And at the Center for Geopolitical Strategy, they didn't want to even name his name and so on. His daughter, Svetlana, made the comment. It is quoted both by Malcolm Muggeridge in his writings and by historian Paul Johnson in Modern Times. Svetlana was standing by the bedside of her father before he died. She said the last thing he did was clench his fist toward the heavens one more time, put his head back on the pillow, and he was gone. This is his daughter raising the question, whatever got into my father to have that kind of hatred and hostility? And when 15 million were killed of his own people, it is interesting that the faculty members and the general who chatted with me there, my wife will tell you, sat around the table with tears in his eyes when he watched what had been done to his own country by his own leadership. So subjective morality would be very good if we all wanted to be nice people and live around each other without any fear of each other. But the reason you lock your doors, and the reason we have our police, and the reason we have our military, and the reason we have our law courts is because when subjective morality becomes totally subjectivized, this is what happens in society. So it's a great idea, but I hope nobody absorbs it. Thank you. We go on to the next one there. Thank you.
Pretty succinct the way Ravi puts it. And actually there's a prayer request for Ravi because he actually had back surgery and they found out that he had a tumor in his spine, and they're confident that they can do surgery or whatever to remove it, but you might want to keep him in prayer. The Lord definitely uses him very powerful. So the problem of evil. Evil can't be explained without knowing good. In other words, you can't say, well, that's evil unless you know what good is, because it's all subjective and there's no comparison that is absolute on the other side. So good requires an objective moral standard. Without God, no moral objective standard exists. That's the problem. So every measurement requires an objective standard outside what is being measured. It can't be measured from within itself. It has to be something outside the measurement. And without an objective moral standard, evil cannot exist in reality. In other words, if God does not exist and there's no objective standard outside of people, an external reference point in God to determine what's absolutely good, then you cannot determine something else is evil. Atheists cannot have it both ways. There can't be true evil and no objective measurement for it. So, the existence of evil, atheists have no way to justify evil. It's not that they don't understand what's evil. They can call certain things evil, but they just have no way of justifying it. That's the issue, right? Without God, there's no explanation of what good is. Without God, there's no objective way to measure what good is. And without God, the concept of better can't be understood unless we know what absolute best is. You can't say things are getting better. Better than what? And how do we find out what best is so that we know how far we have to go? Man has to appeal to a standard beyond him. That's what you don't have in an atheistic system. Without an objective moral standard, it's simply opinion. It's what I prefer as opposed to anybody else. Without an objective moral standard that transcends man, it is mere preference. Opinion, preference, same thing. So let's be clear what's not being said. Atheists can't be moral. They can. We're not saying that. We're not saying that an atheist is not a good person. There are plenty of atheists that are not doing bad things and they're living fine lives, but they just cannot justify their morality. So we're not saying atheists cannot be moral. We're not saying atheists don't know morality. They do, because God has put it in everybody. He's put the conscience that we have into us so that we have a sense of right and wrong. Here's what is being said. Atheists can't justify morality. They can have an opinion about how they know murder is wrong, but they can't provide an immaterial objective standard that establishes why murder is wrong. Because in an atheistic world, there is nothing that's immaterial, including your conscience, including anything else, or the logic that they use to try to defend their point. An immaterial objective standard requires a theistic God. Like C.S. Lewis said, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? It's from Mere Christianity. So if God exists, why is there evil? Well, evil actually presupposes God. Evil can't exist without the existence of good. So evil is not really an argument against God. Evil requires God. We'll get into that. Evil is a privation of good. It's not an entity. In other words, you can't say, okay, I have some evil right here. Everything God created was good, and then evil is some privation or corruption of whatever it is good that God created. For example, I know Frank Turek always uses car and rust and cancer in bodies. I mean, if you take the rust out of the car, you have a better car. If you take the car out of the rust, you have nothing. You see, it's something that requires something that's good in order to deteriorate it. It's the same thing with cancer. If you take the cancer out of a body, then you make the body healthy. If you take the body away from the cancer, you have no place for the cancer to live. Cancer does not exist without the body. So this is why it's important to understand these concepts, because a lot of times people do not think these things through, right? So God created everything good. Evil is the ruining of it. That's really what it amounts to. And that's why evil can only exist if good exists, and good can only exist if God exists. So God created man with a free will. This allows the potential of evil, right? When parents give kids the keys to the car for the first time, God forbid they go out and get in a car accident, that is not the parents creating the evil of the accident, but every time you hand those keys, because people have free wills, there is the potential for them to do something wrong. There's the potential for evil. Freedoms are necessary for the exercise of love. You cannot have real love if you do not have freedom. And it has to be real freedom, not coerced freedom, pressured freedom, or anything like that. God allows man the choice to love him or to hate him. That's true freedom. And God's love is seen in sending his Son to rescue us from our sin. That is the definition of love. It is that giving, sacrificing love. It is something that is not required, but is offered because of the source of love. And man's love for God is seen in the faith response to God's love. So God is the initiator, man is the responder. But we need to understand, without freedom, then it's just fatalism, and people are just robots doing what God is making them do ultimately, or God is withdrawing himself, and then they are doing only what they can do as evil people, sinful people, in making sinful decisions.
Is God good? If he is, why is there suffering and evil? Let's assume for the moment that God is all-powerful. This means that God can do anything that is logically possible. So he can create galaxies and subatomic particles and rainforests and you. But God cannot do what is logically impossible. He cannot make a square circle or a one-ended stick. So can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? No. So what if, when God created human beings, he wanted them to be free? Freedom's a good thing, but if humans are to be free, they cannot be forced to obey God, because freedom without choice is like a square circle. It's a logical contradiction. No choice, no freedom. God didn't want robots. He wanted real people. The first humans endowed with the awesome power of free choice abused their freedom. The tragic consequences of their bad choice and our bad choices ripple across the world. God is responsible for the fact of freedom, but humans are responsible for their acts of freedom. But let's remember, we don't suffer alone. God will put an end to suffering and evil. And God became a man to suffer with us. God is good, and he wants real people like you to know him, but the free choice is yours.
Okay. Now, morality transcends humanity. Everyone has a conscience. And we know that by our own experience, but the Bible teaches that too, though we're not there yet. And conscience is not made of chemicals. If that were the case, how much does the justice molecule weigh? And which one's the moral molecule? In other words, these have no weight. They have no material essence to them. Conscience isn't created by people. I don't make my own conscience, nor does anybody else, which is why their conscience bothers them at times. It transcends humanity. Right and wrong creates guilt, and that's when our conscience bothers us. Now, everyone senses right and wrong. No one's free of guilt, and no one's conscience is silent when they do the wrong thing. So this is a demonstration of the fact that our conscience transcends our humanity. It comes from God. Morality and conscience. Atheists normally have moral positions. They typically agree we shouldn't hurt others. That's a normal position that an atheist would take. I mean, unless there's something wrong with them. Why? Because their conscience dictates a similar morality to those who believe in God. What does it mean when atheists agree? ? In other words, they agree morally, but they call it preference. So if an atheist is in agreement that they say, hey, look, I agree that we shouldn't hurt others. Well, from their perspective, it's preference. From the perspective of a person that believes in God, it's a moral imperative. It means they have the same desire for morality, but they can't intellectually justify it. And that's really where the problem of atheism comes in. It's the justification for morality. It's not a matter of whether they can understand it or not. But they want the same morality because their conscience is given to them by God. Now, they'll do everything to fight that, try to deny God's existence, but the reality is they have a conscience because it's been given to them, not because they have evolved one or it is something that they themselves created. They want it emotionally. In other words, they want the same sense of right and wrong, but they just disagree with it intellectually. This is a self-contradiction. In other words, they're in conflict with themselves. So we've gone through this in points 1 and 2. The truth is knowable. The opposite of true is false. So this is the law of non-contradiction, which they can never get by, even though they'll try to use it. So morality is not relative to culture. It doesn't change when we go to another country, another state, another part of the world. Nazi Germany is an example of this. Genocide is not a fashionable preference. That is something that is detestable and wrong, and we all know that. Morality is not relative to people. What's okay for you is not necessarily okay for me. So when somebody says, well, that's okay for you, well, not necessarily, because if I don't agree with you, that's not okay for me, you see? In other words, we're getting back to the absolute nature of truth and the law of non-contradiction, which are inescapable. Morality is prescriptive. This is what a lot of people don't seem to understand. Morality is what we ought to do. There is an oughtness to morality, and so morality is prescriptive. If you get sick, you go to the doctor, and the doctor prescribes medicine to you. In other words, it's what you ought to take if you want to get better. There is a moral prescriber, otherwise there is no prescription. It does not exist. It has to come from a prescriber. Morality is not descriptive, and what we mean by that is sociology describes by observation. So sociology will describe, the majority of people, they do this, so that's morally acceptable or whatever. And the problem is that we're not dealing with sociology, we're dealing with morality. So sociology just describes what people do. It does not prescribe what they ought to do. Morality is what is right and wrong, and it's not arrived at by majority vote. If 51% of the people say it's okay to harm other people, that doesn't make it okay. And we saw that in Nazi Germany, and it didn't matter how many people wanted to kill 6 million Jews and 6 million others that were a problem for Hitler. It will never be right, which is why the world was against it. Morality prescribes. It's an obligation. So majority vote, you don't arrive by majority vote at what the truth is. You can have 99.9% of the people say that 2 + 2 is 5. It does not change what the truth is. The truth is absolute. It's narrow. It always excludes its opposite. The truth is always going to be in that category, and it doesn't really matter what people's opinion is of it. It's not going to alter it in any way. People can have the opinion that gravity doesn't exist. It's still keeping them on the ground as they deny it. So it's the same thing with any other truth. This is an interview with Justin Brierley and Richard Dawkins that happened after a debate, and it's only a couple of minutes, but it'll give you an idea of where the atheist has to come from, and I'll play it for you now.
But when you make a value judgment, don't you immediately step yourself outside of this evolutionary process and say there is the reason this is good is because it's good, and you don't have any way to stand on that statement?
But my value judgment itself could come from my evolutionary past, and I suppose.
So therefore, it's just as random in a sense as any product of evolution.
Well, you could say that, but it doesn't. In any case, nothing about it makes it more probable that there is anything supernatural.
Okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we've evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. I mean,
you could say that, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I know it was a little difficult to hear because of the background noise, but Dawkins answers the question. He takes the position that we're trying to make the point. He agrees that saying rape is wrong is as arbitrary as evolving 5 fingers rather than 6, which is definitely a problem when it comes to worldviews. So the moral implications of atheism, this is from Frank Turek's book, Stealing from God, which I would highly recommend for you. He says, if you follow Darwinian principles consistently, you get to the kind of moral outworking that James Rachels suggests. Rachels is the author of Created from Animals, the moral implications of Darwinism. He defends the Darwinian view that human species has no more inherent value than any other species. Speaking of the mentally handicapped, Rachels writes, quote, "What are we to say about them? The natural conclusion, according to the doctrine we are considering, which is Darwinism, would be that their status is that of mere animals, and perhaps we should go on to conclude that they may be used as non-human animals are used, perhaps as laboratory subjects or as food," end of quote. This is an absurdity. I mean, but this is the natural result, and the following the ideals of Darwinism and atheism, this is where you come to. This guy, as detestable as his perspectives are, this is the natural result of atheism. He's only being consistent with his atheistic worldview. So, and he's mixing that with Darwinism. So, yeah, it's pretty bad. But unfortunately, that's where we go with that.
If God does not exist, only molecules exist, what is the nature of the moral standard called goodness, and why are we obligated to obey it? What is that little ruler if it's not God's nature?
Okay, back to where I started. Frank, can you think of any reason why sexually molesting a child is bad?
I can think of reasons, but they're all based on moral principles which require God.
No, they don't.
Sure they do.
No, really. Do you really need God to tell you and explain to you why it's wrong to molest a child?
No, not to tell me why it's wrong, but you don't need God to know right and wrong. You don't need God to be good. You just need God to justify what good is.
No. What? Right there. Stop right there and leave out the God part. I know why it's wrong. Full stop.
You know why it's wrong, but why is it wrong independent of you knowing it?
So Plato refuted this 2.5 millennia ago. It's called the Euthyphro problem, or the Euthyphro dilemma. That is, if God says, say, murder is wrong, although technically by definition that's what murder means, wrongful killing. But in any case, are there reasons why God is saying that? Yes, God has his reasons. Okay, give us the reasons.
Made in the image of God.
And skip the middleman. All we need are the reasons why.
But see, that implies a moral principle. When you, like before you said, the reason you shouldn't sexually molest a child is because they're sentient beings and you wouldn't want them doing it to you, or vice versa, or whatever. Those are all other moral principles that need a source. What is the source on atheism?
The source.
What is the standard?
Leave atheism out of it. Atheism isn't anything. It's just lack of belief in God, full stop. We could talk about civil rights, civil liberties, the rule of law.
Where do rights come
conventions. I think rights come from, the basis of it is human nature and what all of us want. Now, I think we're born with an inherent, innate sense of right and wrong. We know from research, like in Paul Bloom's lab at Yale, for example, with tiny infants. These are like 6 months to a year old babies. And they are shown a little puppet show. So imagine there's this ramp, and this puppet's pushing this ball up the ramp, and one puppet comes up and bashes the ball back down and is fighting the puppet. And then,
Michael,
let me finish. This is a great experiment.
Okay.
I'm making an argument for
I'm not disagreeing that we all know right from wrong. That's not my point. My point is not epistemology. How do you know right from wrong? My point is, what is rightness on an atheistic, materialistic worldview?
On a humanist worldview, right and wrong is determined by a combination of our innate moral sense, our upbringing, what our parents teach us, our family, our social communities, and so on, which, by the way, have changed a lot. You guys would have been in favor of burning witches and enslaving blacks centuries ago. You don't believe that anymore. Maybe 50 years ago, most of you would have voted, probably about 90% would have voted that blacks and whites getting married should be illegal. It's not God's plan. God separated the races by continents. These were arguments made in the 20th century.
Okay,
Nobody here would argue that today.
Michael, your book...
Gay marriage. Most of you are probably against this. I contend probably half of you tonight are already in favor of it, or at least let it happen. In 10 years, we won't even be talking about gay marriage.
Michael, why are any of these
right
things...
right and wrong shifts over time, and it doesn't come from religion. It doesn't come from the Bible. There's no reinterpretation. Oh, when Paul said this, he really meant gays should get married. No, that's not how moral change happens. It's not happening through religion.
I'm not talking about moral change. I'm talking about the grounding of morality. If we're just molecules, well then if we do it, then who's to say Hitler was worse than Mother Teresa?
Again.
Who's to say that if there's no standard beyond either of them, how can you say Hitler was wrong?
So that was Frank and Michael Shermer, piece of their debate. You can watch that online, the whole thing if you'd like. I don't think Shermer really made the point. He kept trying to just define things the way he wanted to and say that it's as is. Now, this next clip is with Silverman, who is the, or at least when they made the debate, he was the president of the American Atheistic Association. But you got to listen carefully to the comparison that's made because the statement that Silverman makes, we will take a quick look at afterwards. Frank Turek, when he was talking to Shermer, discussed ontology and epistemology. I'm going to mention that again, and then we'll talk about that right after this next clip.
David, you were just talking about leaving a kid in an orphanage rather than putting it with a gay couple is immoral. I thought you just told us that there is no such thing as objective morality. Is it immoral, or you just don't like it?
No, I said it was no such thing as objective morality. I said all morality is relative.
So why are you objecting to somebody who doesn't want to put a kid with a homosexual couple then? Why are you objecting to that if there's no...
We have the right to object. We are always doing that, okay? We're always making these choices. It's not wrong to say that I'm making my independent choices, independent of any other book or any other holy book. We all make the same moral choices. I find it wholly immoral.
Oh, according to what standard? Your own standard?
According to my standards,
yes.
yes.
Well, that's okay.
That's exactly the same way you do it.
Okay, well, but are you condemning somebody else for having a different relative standard than you?
No, I'm saying we all have to take responsibility for our moral judgments. We are all making those decisions in real time, just like you are.
Okay,
for the same reason that you're not going into Leviticus and saying, let's kill the gays, that's immoral to you and me. We're making that relative moral decision. You're supporting your relative moral decision with the Bible, with other Bible quotes that you're finding.
Yeah, but you're confusing the decision with the existence of a moral standard. You're saying that there is no moral standard, or there is a standard objective outside of humanity to which we should obey?
There is no objective moral standard. We are responsible for our own actions.
Responsible to who?
To ourselves and to our society.
Which society? Mother Teresa's or Hitler's?
The society in which we live.
Okay, so
Yes, this is not an easy question.
So at Nuremberg, then, we really had no right to convict the Nazis of obeying their government.
We, as a world society, judge our criminals, and we judge them as we see fit.
I know we judge them, so you're saying we just judge them based on our preferences. You know, in some cultures, they take care of their babies. In other cultures, they eat their babies. Which do you prefer?
I prefer the ones where they take care of the babies. I also prefer the ones where the Nazis don't do terrible things under the name of God.
But it's just a preference.
Yes.
Okay, so
it's an opinion.
Okay, well, if it's just an opinion, you're saying then, if it's just an opinion, I don't know why you condemn a Christian couple for not wanting to put a baby with a homosexual, because that's just their morality that they have every right to express themselves, don't they?
They have every right to do it. I'm saying it's a wholly immoral position.
According to who?
According to me.
Well, okay, well, that's just David
Of course,
Silverman.
it's all according to us. We all make our own moral decisions.
Yeah, I understand.
The only difference between you and me is that I take responsibility for my moral decisions, and you justify your moral decisions by finding a passage in the Bible that matches your moral decisions and saying, aha, it's objective morality.
Well, if there is no objective morality, then we have... It's even hard to talk this way because we say we have no right, but that implies a moral standard too.
No, we have a societal right. Society
according
gives us the
to
rights.
You, or according
to
Hitler,
society,
or
according to the government that we create. Yes.
Okay. Well, then we had no real way to condemn the Nazis for what they did.
That's the hard answer. Is you're correct. The hard answer is it is a matter of opinion. The hard answer is they thought they were doing objective good. They did.
Well,
so we condemn them as a society, but you know we do this all the time.
Yeah, they may have thought they were doing good, but they really weren't according to a standard. But the only way you could know whether
according
they were
to whose
really
standard?
The unchanging, objective, moral standard that is God's nature. And
they did it under the name of God.
Well, there's a lot of people that you don't judge a philosophy or a religion by its abuse, David. Jesus never said that we ought to go kill the Jews, quite obviously. He was a Jew himself. You should know that.
Yeah.
Okay? So... because people have abused religion doesn't mean that the religion is false.
The fact that people have abused religion shows you that morality is relative. If it was objective, you couldn't abuse it.
No, you're confusing sociology and morality. Sociology is how people behave. Morality is how they ought to behave. we all ought to behave a certain way, but we fail to. By the way, that's why we need a Savior. Okay.
You're clapping for that?
So I think it's pretty clear. Silverman, and we'll analyze in 1 minute here what he was saying, but what he obviously misses is it really doesn't matter whether you take responsibility. Taking responsibility does not justify you, give you a basis for what you do or why you do it. Taking responsibility is just owning up to the fact that you did it, but that's not that gives no justification. And my admitting that I did something, though that may be morally right to do that in a moral universe, that's not anywhere close to dealing with the issue that Turek was bringing up during the debate. So the analysis reveals an error in reason, very basic reason that Silverman uses, actually. So he confuses knowing the moral standard, which is epistemology. That's the study of knowledge. In other words, how we know what we know. He confuses that with the existence of a moral standard, which is ontology. So ontology is the study of the nature of being. In other words, why something exists in the first place. So the issue isn't the fact that I can argue within this framework and say, well, I know right and wrong. I know this is right or that's right or this is wrong and that's wrong. That's not the issue. The question is, why are they right and wrong in the first place? It's an ontological question. It's not an epistemological question. People understand things epistemologically. In other words, they know things are right and wrong because God has put it in them through their conscience, and it's stamped in them because they're made in the image of God. So now, again, we haven't got to that place yet. However, we are getting to the place, and we have reached the place where the issue regarding an objective moral standard exists simply because there is a theistic being that has created everything and is separate from the world. And again, everybody has that as an experience. So Silverman confuses how people behave, which is sociology, with how they ought to behave, which is morality. So we have a few clips here of Turek coming up, and I'll just play through them. I think they're pretty educational, and then that will pretty much bring us to the conclusion, at least for the first half of this presentation.
Now, how do we know there's an objective moral law? First of all, we pointed out before that absolutes are undeniable. And we know this by our reactions, not our actions. In other words, you know right from wrong by your reactions, not your actions. For example, if I steal from you, I may not think stealing is wrong, but what do I say the second you steal from me? Hey, something's wrong here. If someone comes up to you and says, I don't believe in right and wrong, what should you say to him, or what should you do to him? You kick him in the shins, right? Hey, how about that? Is that wrong? What are they going to say? Of course they're going to say it's wrong, right? They react when they're wrong, and that helps tell them what really is right and what really is wrong. Don't look at me, or don't try and determine or discover what I think about morality by what I do, because I do wrong things all the time. But you discover what I think about morality by how I react when you wrong me. Then I suddenly get real morally indignant, don't I? Okay? So we know it by our reactions. You remember I told you the story about the blue folders. If you remember this, about the professor who gave the student an F because the student gave his paper to him in a blue folder. Remember that? He said all morality's subjective. There's no such thing as right and wrong. There's no such thing as justice or injustice. All a matter of opinion. You like chocolate, I like vanilla. That was the student's paper. Professor put an F on the front of the paper. Said, F, I don't like blue folders. And the student was morally outraged, right? What do you mean, F, I don't like blue folders? That's not fair. That's not right. That's not just. The professor said, wait a minute. Your paper said there's no such thing as fairness, rightness, or justice.
You get an F because I don't like blue. See, he reacted to how he was treated, and immediately he knew what really was wrong about what the professor did. There is a rightness, a fairness, a justice out there, and he reacted when he was treated unfairly. We also can't know injustice unless we know justice. C.S. Lewis, one of the great Christians of all time, who started as an atheist, he started as an atheist because he couldn't believe in a good God with all the evil and injustice in the world. And then he realized something. He said, I wouldn't know injustice unless I knew justice, and I wouldn't know justice unless I knew God. Here's what he said. He said, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You don't know what a crooked line is unless you know what a straight line is, right? You don't know what injustice is unless you know what justice is. You can't know that somebody is not right, i.e. wrong, unless you know what is right. And atheists are notorious for claiming that Christians are immoral. But how do they know what immorality is unless there's a standard of morality beyond them? Now, we got to be very careful here when we're talking about this, because atheists take this the wrong way. Let me point out what we are not saying and what we are saying. We are not saying that atheists can't be moral. They can. And we're not saying that atheists don't know morality. They do. They know it just like we do, in the sense that it's written on their hearts. But here's what we are saying. Atheists can't justify morality in their worldview. They can say there's a moral law, but they can't give any reason why there is a moral law, because there's no standard beyond themselves. We could put it this way. Atheists can theorize about how we know murder is wrong, but atheism provides no objective standard that establishes why murder is wrong. They say, you got this sense of morality from Darwinism. First of all, Darwinism can't explain how we got here physically, much less how morality got here, which is not physical, it's immaterial. But even if you grant them that, even if you were to say, we learned morality from Darwinism, even if you grant them that, that doesn't explain why murder is wrong. It simply explains how you know it's wrong. See the difference? There's a difference between how you know something and that something exists. And here's where the atheists confuse themselves all the time and try and confuse us. In fact, there's an atheist running around out here lately. His name is Christopher Hitchens. In 2007, he wrote a book called God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. You may have seen this book. He's a very witty guy, Christopher Hitchens. I actually kind of like him. You see him, he's debated a lot of Christians lately. He's debated Dinesh D'Souza, who I think did a pretty good job with him. But Hitchens is real witty, real quick, knows a lot of history, a lot of literature. But his entire book, is based on a false premise. The premise is how religion poisons everything. But the truth is that religion does not poison everything. Everything poisons religion. First of all, there would be no poison in the moral sense unless God existed. So he wouldn't know that, how religion poisons everything, because there's no poison unless God exists. Morally, from a moral perspective. See what I'm saying here? But secondly, his whole premise is that religious people have done evil. And so therefore it's not true. Well, that doesn't follow. Because people have done evil doesn't prove it's not true. In fact, we agree with atheists that some atheists live better moral lives than Christians. It's true, okay? It's sad but true. Some atheists who don't have the Holy Spirit sometimes live better moral lives than we do. Why? Well, we have all the Holy Spirit, but he doesn't have all of us, right? Because we don't always give ourselves to him, right? We resist the Holy Spirit. Read the book of Acts. They're resisting the Holy Spirit all the time, aren't they? But secondly, we also point out that some who say they're church people have poisoned the teachings of Christ. Church history has often been immoral, unjust, and even overtly evil. It's true. Church history has been immoral, unjust, and overtly evil. But, here's what we are saying, there is no moral or immoral, just or unjust, good or evil, unless God exists. So people like Christopher Hitchens and other atheists, like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and some of these folks you may have heard of, they're sawing off the limb on which they sit. Because morality comes from God. There's only one place you can ground objective morality, and that's in an immaterial being, because it's an immaterial thing, morality. And if atheism's true, if all we are is chemicals, if we're just glorified chemicals in the periodic table, there is no such thing as anything immaterial. So morality doesn't exist. Yet here they are pounding the table. You Christians, you're so evil, you're so immoral. How do you know that? What do you mean immoral? Your worldview can't justify morality. So we can agree with these folks. Yeah, church is messed up. And doesn't Jesus talk about that a lot, actually? Who does he go after more than anybody else? The church, or the Pharisees at the time. The religious people who thought they were so righteous, they looked good on the outside, but on the inside, their heart wasn't right. He went after them more than anybody else. So just because you say you go to church, just because you say you're a Christian, may not mean that you really are. Jesus said, some will come to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we do this in your name? Didn't we do that in your name? And what's the Lord going to do? Away from me, I never knew you. Values conflict. This is the moral dilemma situation. You're in a lifeboat, and this is what college professors are known to do, to try and teach you that morality is relative. You're in a lifeboat, fit for 4, you got 5 people on board. If you don't throw somebody off, everyone's going to die. Okay, break up into groups. You guys decide what you would do, 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 and you guys decide what you would do. Then come back after 10 minutes of discussion. Well, they all come back. They all have different answers. All the groups have different answers. And the professor says, see, morality is relative. Is it? Question. Why are you in a dilemma with this scenario? You're in a dilemma because there is a moral law. In fact, there would be no dilemma if life wasn't so supremely valuable, right? If life wasn't valuable, you'd say, who cares? Throw everybody off. It doesn't matter. But you don't say that. Why? Because you realize that there is an absolute moral right to life. There would be no moral dilemmas unless there was an absolute moral law. The very fact that you're in a dilemma is because you recognize that absolute moral law. And in this fallen world, where we have bad things happen, sometimes absolutes are going to conflict. That doesn't mean there's not a right answer. It means that sometimes you might not know what that answer is, but it doesn't prove that morality is not absolute. It is absolute. Look, there are very difficult problems in morality, and there are very simple problems in morality too. The difficult problems don't negate the simple problems. Just like there are difficult problems in math or calculus, there are very simple problems too, like 2 + 2 = 4, right? And just because you might not know the answer to some equation that goes 10 pages in a textbook somewhere, doesn't mean you don't know that 2 + 2 = 4, right? So don't let complex problems get you away from the fact that there are simple problems and simple solutions. And there are simple principles of morality. And 99.9% of the time when we have to make a moral decision, it's a moral decision based on an easy black or white choice, right? Every once in a while you get over here and you go, gee, I don't know what the right thing is. But this issue over here doesn't negate the fact that there is a right over here, right? That you can know easily. And the moral law written on your heart means everybody knows intuitively what the right thing is on the big issues. It doesn't mean that we have every detail of morality figured out. How about when the Nazi comes to your door? Right? What do you do then? Hast du Juden hier? You've got Jews upstairs in your attic. Schnell, schnell, kommen Sie hier. Hast du Juden hier? What are you going to do? You do. They're in there. Don't lie. Tell the truth to a murderer? What are you going to do? I know what I do. Lie. Why? Because when absolutes conflict, and Christians can disagree on this, but I'm just giving you my view. When absolutes conflict, the greater obligation takes precedence over the lesser obligation. You have a greater obligation to protect life than to tell the truth to a murderer. Now, some theologians like Augustine didn't agree with this. But I think, and this is called graded absolutism for those of you who are taking notes, that there's a hierarchy. And the hierarchy exempts you from the lower obligation. You can think of a hierarchy like this. We have the greatest obligation to God, the next obligation to people, and the final obligation to things, right? Last year, or earlier this year, whenever it was, Michael Vick got into a lot of trouble for dog fighting. It's terrible, dog fighting. It's awful. But in this country, we're more upset over dogs being killed than human beings. It's true. Think about it. No moral outrage over someone going into an abortion clinic, having the baby completely delivered virtually, and having her brain sucked out with a vacuum cleaner. No moral outrage over that, but Michael Vick killing dogs? Ooh, prison time. I'm not saying he ought not go to prison, don't get me wrong. I'm simply saying that I think our priorities, we've inverted this, haven't we? All right, let's get to the bottom line. We disagree on values. We disagree. So therefore, values are relative. First of all, one of the reasons for this is not an issue of denial. It might be confusion. Here's the confusion. The confusion is the difference between ends and means. I'll give you an example. Both pacifists and militarists desire peace in the end. They only disagree on how peace should be attained, right? Some of this might have to do even in the Iraq war situation, right? Some people are saying, look, we ought not be at war. Other people are saying, no, we ought to be at war. We ought to be at war. But both parties really do want peace. Most of them do anyway, right? The question is, what's the best means to get to that end? Is the best means to say, no, we're not going to fight anybody? Or is the best means to say, look, we need to fight them because if we don't, there's going to be more dire consequences down the road. You can debate that. But look, both sides want the same end. Both sides want peace. I don't know anybody really out there who wants war all the time. So it's an ends and means situation.
Okay, we have a couple of more clips, but we're hitting an hour here, so I want to stop the video at this point, and then we'll just continue it on in part 2. So this is probably a good place to stop, and I think it's important to understand the points that we've got to so far. I think Frank did a great job in doing kind of an analysis on the whole thing. He'll bring up a couple of other points and then have a question answer with a kid at a college when we start it up next time. And other than that, I pray you continue to stay in God's Word, and He'd also continue to bless you as you do. God bless you guys.